I'm Euro,
I'm Chris,
and
and
this
this
is
is
Fork
Fork Bomb.
Bomb. February 13th, 2017. What if Microsoft never existed is the topic of today's show.
And we have another special guest with us, Gene McCulley, longtime technologist and tech entrepreneur, currently most known for being the founder and owner of Stackframe LLC in Sanford, Florida. And he has been brought on because he, aside from being just an all-around great guy,
Really cool dude.
has seen time and space and was into the technology industry before Microsoft existed. So we're going to have many questions.
Yeah, we're glad to have you on the show, Gene.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I listened to, after I spoke to Chris about the podcast, I went back and listened to your first three, and it was very entertaining. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
That's great. Thanks.
Gene, when did you get started with computing? What was your first experience with hardware, software? When did you really get into it?
Sure. So let's see. It was around 1980. It was my first messing around with computers. I was in a very fortunate kind of time and place there. The elementary school I went to had a couple computers, and my family was willing to spend the what had seemed at the time a ridiculous amount of money to give me a toy that I wanted because I thought it was interesting, and I spent a lot of time with it. So around 1980, I think, was my first tinkering around with computers, which would have been the Tandy Radio Shack Model 3 at the time, and the color computer.
So the
Nice.
Radio Shack Tandy was your first real desktop then?
Oh yeah, and well, I mean, it wasn't mine. So that was my first experience, with a computer. Was those two? They were in my classroom, the elementary classroom. So I was able to sit down with them to spend time, but I didn't own one until a couple years later. Like a year later, I guess I got. At the time, Radio Shack had this crazy little device called a pocket computer, which was very underpowered but could run BASIC. And again, like I said, I convinced my parents that was like a good expense of money, which it barely was, and taught myself BASIC on that. And then a couple years later, I got a VIC-20 from a summer of mowing lawns and working on boats. And then the next summer, a Commodore 64. So those were my first computers.
Very neat. I recently just learned what a VIC-20 is, and the history behind it is tumultuous. That's not the right word. Full of turmoil and very very fascinating. But that'll have to be something for another episode. So
I should say, though, I'm sorry, I just realized I should say just before that I had an Atari 2600, which was not programmable unless you bought this terrible BASIC cartridge that came out like 2 years after it was available. I had an Atari 2600, but you couldn't really do much on that other than play really, really limited games.
Okay, so you got into computing right when Microsoft was first getting a start. So post Altair, but right when there were actual, right before they were big, right?
Oh yeah, well, definitely. So at the time they weren't. They weren't a company I would recognize. Like I recognize, Commodore and Radio Shack and Apple and IBM and stuff like that. But I do remember wondering what it meant every time you turned on a Commodore 64 and it said, Microsoft Basic when you started it up.
Okay, so you did have you were loading Microsoft Basic on your computers, like the Commodore had it, I guess. Did the Tandy machine have it as well?
Yeah, well, just to clarify, loaded on. No, it was in the ROM. So when you hit power, that's the first thing you saw was Microsoft Basic. Yeah, and the color computer, if I remember right, it dropped you right into Basic. The Model 3 dropped you you started BASIC, I think, from the command prompt, but the VIC-20 and the Commodore 64 would drop you right into a BASIC command prompt.
I guess we should start there then with BASIC, because I mean, I don't know if you've ever played the game Chrononauts, but it's set up as linchpins and ripple points. You change a linchpin in time, and it affects ripple points. And so it seems like one solid linchpin here is the invention of BASIC, or Microsoft's BASIC. So you said that the Commodore 64 had Microsoft BASIC. So that's pretty much a direct descendant of the tiny BASIC they made for the Altair, isn't it?
I think so. I'm not sure on that history. And the VIC-20 had Commodore BASIC as well. I was using the Commodore 64 as an example, and I'm pretty sure that the BASIC that was in the TRS-80s was licensed from Microsoft as well. So yeah, they were pretty ubiquitous.
In that historical Microsoft video you sent me, Hero, I think they did say that it was Microsoft's BASIC that made it into the Commodore and the VICs. And
that's right.
So yeah, so if they didn't make that BASIC, either somebody else's BASIC would have become ubiquitous, or it just may not have happened.
Well, and there's a big first mover advantage there, because all those machines at that time, right? So that time I'm talking about the Commodore 64 and the TRS-80. There's a bunch of weird little machines, right, that didn't survive. Like nowadays we have this monoculture of hardware and software, almost, right? But everything's like x86 or ARM. But we had a lot of weird little machines. But like the TRS-80s, all the like the Model 3 and all those, they had a Z80 chip. A lot of things had a Z80, like the Spectrum ZX81, and a lot of other things. And then a lot of other things had the 6502. So the Commodore VIC-20, the Commodore 64, the Apple II, they all had a 6502. And so if you're developing BASIC and you target those two chips, those two CPUs, then everybody who's building a computer on that, all you can do is make a very minor changes to input and output, and your BASIC will run on them. So whoever gets there first has a huge advantage.
And in this case, that was Microsoft.
That was Microsoft, yes.
So, sorry, go ahead, Euro.
Well, so BASIC was made in the 1960s, but then it was refined to Tiny BASIC, and then Microsoft just took it and commercialized it with the Altair, and they made some improvements between 1975 and 1979. There were improvements made to I guess BASIC, and then they made those deals with all those companies to load it into the firmware, like you said, Gene. So if we didn't have Microsoft do that, I think there would have been another company that would have stepped up, and I think this is a good segue to digital research. I think that Gary Kildall's company might have been the one to actually do this. They were pretty big back then, and I think that they may have stepped up. They would have seen the opportunity, the Altair being there with no operating system, and they may have been the ones to do it. I'm not sure, but I wanna say that maybe. And then would they have gone to Apple and done that as well? I mean, Apple was really small, especially back then. I mean, they were small. So would Apple have gone to digital research and said, hey, we need an operating system? I mean, that's what Microsoft did with the Altair. That Microsoft went up to MITS and said, we know you have something special, but you need software for it, and we're here to do that for you. Would digital research have gone to a small garage, little garage company like Apple and said, "Hey, we have an operating system here that could work on your machine"? So that's one of those things where it's like, I don't know, because would they have seized that opportunity?
I think it's within the realm of plausibility, because they were founded in 1974. When did the Altair come out?
75, right? I think it was 1975.
I better just look it up. What do you think, Gene?
I don't remember. That was slightly before my time. So anything I know about the Altair is from just from reading things about it. I don't remember much of that.
So
Fair enough. Well, let's say that.
yeah, let's just go with.
I think I would agree with you. They would probably have been the most likely. Um, Even if it happened later, for all we know, it just could have been slightly delayed.
I mean, because you had other companies that had they had mainframe software. So I really doubt that HP would have gone to Apple and said, "Hey, we have an operating system that we can that you guys can have," or I guess pay the license. But I doubt a big company like HP would have done that. So that's what I'm thinking. That's why I'm thinking Digital Research may have been the one to step up. The other one could have been Atari. Just because I mean Atari had, yes, they had their home consoles, but they were starting to develop their computer line as well. So Atari could have come up and said, hey, we could license, we could work out a deal. But I really think that the strong contender here would have been Digital Research.
I think I think you're right.
I just don't know if they would agree. I don't know if they would have seized that opportunity just because of what happened later with IBM and Digital Research. So, but anyway, so it's really interesting to that point in history so early on, the different things that could have happened that didn't, but certainly interesting to theorize. So I guess at this point we should probably jump a bit to the early 1980s. So no Microsoft, so no BASIC. You have other stuff loaded in ROM, possibly Digital Research's, let's say, version of BASIC. So Digital Research had their operating system, CP/M, and I believe it was written for quite a few different processors. So you had CP/M 80, which was written for the Z80, the Zilog processor, and then you had CP/M 86, which was written for the IBM. So DOS wouldn't have been DOS. It would have been something like CP/M, or maybe even just DR DOS. Which is really fun to theorize, and I actually never used CP/M before. And Gene, this is where I hope you can enlighten us, because I'm not really familiar on what CP/M was like, and I guess you used both, right? CP/M and MS-DOS at some point.
Yeah, I certainly used both. The thing that got me involved in your podcast is that Chris had mentioned doing some research, and I saw that he was studying CP/M, and I mentioned, hey, we got a Kpro 2 at the office. A Kpro 2 was this big luggable that came out in the mid '80s, I think, and it was one of the first luggable computers. It built like a big enormous briefcase, like 40 pounds, and the keyboard folds out of it, and it runs CP/M on the Z80. I think it had an S100 bus. So that was pretty much at that time, that was the other standard, was S100 bus, Z80, and CP/M. So there was like a lot of business software kind of coalescing around that standard.
So
that's great. That's still around. That's amazing. I actually want to know why that machine is there.
You know what? I don't even think it boots anymore. The last time I tried to boot it was at least 10 years ago. It's more than 10 years ago. But it just looks funny sitting in the office. We got it, and we have this lab area, and you've got all these iMacs and a small rack of server hardware, and then there's a Kpro 2 and an original Fat Mac, a 512K Macintosh sitting there.
That's
and so I just think it's amusing to have it there, and I can't bear to throw it away.
And you never should.
No, don't. Yeah, that's an important part of history.
So I have to ask, what was that like using CP/M? You said it was your main workstation for a while. I know very early on, if you made a change to the disk, the operating system wouldn't know about it, and you could very easily corrupt the entire disk. until a later version of CPM where at least it would say, where at least it would throw an error and hang the system. But the first version, you can make a change, the OS wouldn't know, and you would just start writing bad data. Did you ever have?
Well, I didn't have
deal with
any
it?
experience with that version. I don't know. I didn't even know that. The bulk of my CPM experience was using that Kpro 2. There were some other machines that I used CPM on, though I can't remember all of what they were. There was in the town I grew up in, there was a little computer shop, and they had this zoo of machines. It would seem like now, right? Because they've all died off, but. So I got to tinker around with these computers, but that Kpro 2 was the most I spent any time on doing CPM. And you could certainly shoot yourself in the foot, but what you would normally do though is that that Kpro 2 had 2 floppy drives and no hard drive, of course. And so everything you did that wasn't in RAM, if you were dealing with a file, you were dealing with one of those floppy drives, and you would generally what would happen is you would put in one 5 1/4 inch disc to boot CPM. The machine would come up. Then you would put in a disk into one drive for your application, like a word processor, and then you put another disk into the other drive for your data. So, okay, I'm going to work on a document. That document's on this disk. I'd put it in that drive B. Drive A would have the disk with the program on it that's the word processor, which potentially bits of it getting paged out, swapped in and out. They were called overlays at the time. You'd have, not all the program could fit in memory, so it would run part of the program, and then maybe you wanted to invoke a spell corrector, so it'd load in the spell corrector part of the program and run that. But when you were doing that, you generally run that from a read-only disk, a disk with the tab covered, so you couldn't write to it. There was a little tab, an optical sensor in the drive, was just a way to tell is this disk meant to be read-only or read-write. So I don't remember ever having trouble like that. The most trouble I had was just, limitations of the hardware. Like, those disks were lossy. Like if you didn't use one for a while, someone got a magnet too close, you'd lose a few bits here or there, and then something would be corrupted.
I see.
Chris, I looked this up, and so basically what would happen is if you inserted the disk and you typed in dir to get a directory of the disk, okay, and then you took out the disk and you put in another disk and you started writing to that disk, it would still think that the directory structure is still like the other disk, and it would corrupt everything. So that was that was the first version of CPM 1.0. So I don't remember. I actually don't know which version fixed that. I want to say 2 or even 3.0, but yeah, that was definitely fixed. But that's how that worked. So CPM, Gene, did you have enough experience in with CPM to be able to compare it to MS-DOS?
It felt really similar. So early versions of DOS were a lot like CPM. Just little things were changed, like the names of basic, not basic the programming language, but like rudimentary commands were slightly different. And it's far enough away in time now that I can't remember exactly what was different, but it really felt the same. You just had to remember what was different. The little bits were different. It wasn't like the difference between like DOS and Unix or DOS and Windows or whatever. It was really just like a different flavor of the same thing.
That was where the conventions for like A drive, B drive got started. Typing dir to get a directory listing.
Yeah, I seem to remember like the slashes were in a different direction or something. Maybe I'm misremembering that. But little things like that, like you just had to remember which one you were on. But the overall fundamentals were the same.
I do remember reading that the copy command was especially weird. It didn't have the word copy at all in it.
Yeah, I don't remember that. But certainly, you had to make both of them had to make decisions about what was a built-in command and what was a program that ran off the disk, right? Like dir has to be a program that's built in because you don't want to load a program called dir off the disk to read the disk, right? And so I seem to remember they had made different decisions about which were actual programs and which were built-in commands.
pip.com, PIP, that was the copy command.
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's vaguely familiar to me.
Yeah, that actually, Gene, that now that you pointed that out about the different commands either being built in or actual separate programs, was one of the reasons why CPM was so popular amongst other uh, a lot of different vendors. Was because CPM had the two components. So you had that CCP component, and you had the oh boy, I had the name and I already forgot it. Oh my goodness, it was CCP and C BIOS. Um, the first one just handling the input output, and then the other one handling I believe was applications. I don't know this part too well, but anyway, what it was what made it easy was that they only had to write to the first part. That was the part that was customizable, the BIOS portion. Okay, you had to customize that for each computer, the Commodore PET and the different systems. The K-Pro being another one, and then the other subsystem, that CCP system, that could stay the same. So only the portion that had to be written, that was the only thing that had to change, and then they could just create another version of CPM. So that made it very popular with vendors, and that's why CPM had was popular at the time. Uh, so they could do that with the Z80 chip and the 8088 and the 8086 and whatnot. Um, so I was just thinking about CPM, and I always I wonder, okay, so if we had gone the digital research route, well, I think Gary Kildall would still be alive today. Uh, Sadly, he passed in, I guess, unknown circumstances, right? Because nobody really knows what happened. Um,
Early '90s, there was a bar fight involved, but after that, the circumstances are murky. But I guess we've been kind of dancing all around the main point of this. What wound up happening was originally IBM wanted to go with digital research to use CPM for the main operating system of the IBM PC, but they were not able to agree on terms. And this was even after Microsoft had said to IBM, "Yeah, go with CPM." So they they weren't able to agree on terms, and then they went with Microsoft instead. So maybe they would
it
have.
was a non-disclosure agreement. They couldn't agree on that.
That's right.
Um,
DRI didn't want to sign the NDA, right?
IBM was very secretive about their personal computer, so they had everybody sign strict non-disclosure agreements, and DRI just weren't gonna do it. I mean, there's that rumor out there that apparently Gary Kildall was flying his jet during the time that IBM came calling, but that's not true. But yeah, what really happened was a non-disclosure agreement. They wouldn't agree to it, and so Microsoft did, and well, that's kind of how that came to be.
So maybe there would have been a bit more haggling back and forth, or something that we didn't consider. I mean, Microsoft bought DOS from. Oh, geez, I should know this. I'm terrible for not knowing this.
Seattle Computer
Yes,
Company.
thank you. For
Yep.
all we know, digital research may have said no. IBM may have found out about Seattle Computer Company, and that person may have won the license agreement with IBM.
Yeah, that's another possibility. Although that version of DOS was pretty much a clone of CPM, so that was why they were so close, and that's why they just basically bought it from them and put Microsoft on the label, modified it just a bit for the IBM BIOS, and then that's it. And that kind of, actually, Chris, they actually did sell CPM as well, because IBM realized that since that other product was a clone of CPM, that they could get into some kind of legal troubles. So they also offered CPM as a software to for the IBM PC, but I believe the price was something like $240, and this is $240 for back then, which was more.
Well, if I remember right,
$240.
the first versions of CPM you could get on the PC required a card you put in that had a Z80 on it. And so you could run the Z80 CPM software on there. And basically it used the IBM PC there as just like an input-output system.
Okay.
So what do you think, Gene?
Well, about which part? About the how well DR DOS would have done? Or
Which way it would have gone?
Oh, no,
I mean,
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a reasonable guess that digital research, would have taken over there. I really don't know. I haven't thought about it too much. It certainly, the path you described seems plausible to me, just like you said.
So I think that if IBM had not done that bad deal with DRA about offering CPM for $240, while MS-DOS was being offered for $40, so everybody, of course, went and got the Microsoft product. I think people may have trusted DRI more because, I mean, back then DRI was a big thing. They were a respectable company.
Well, just to be clear, when you say people made a choice for Microsoft, they the earliest versions of the IBM PC, actually for quite a number of years, every time you bought one, you had MS-DOS. It was called IBM DOS or whatever. That's on PC DOS.
Sure. Yeah.
But no one made that choice, right? They spent $2,500 to get a machine. It had Microsoft's DOS in it already, and so to go buy something else would have been an extra decision to make.
Yeah, well, they certainly didn't want to pay the extra amount to load the other version either. So that definitely hurt digital research sales. So they had to move on to other things because, I mean, they still of course sold CPM and ported it over to other systems, but without IBM's computers selling with CPM, I mean that basically, I mean, after a while, I believe it was around 1985, 86 that the CPM was pretty much done. Not even magazines were covering it anymore. So everything kind of was geared towards Microsoft. Microsoft didn't just stay at DOS though, which is another important thing. Microsoft started developing business applications. They saw that catering to the business sector was where the money was going to be and what was going to drive sales. So they developed Microsoft Word pretty quickly and then ported it over to the Apple and whatnot. So I'm just also thinking, okay, so digital research would I mean, I guess they could have formed their own Office products, or maybe they would have just left VisiCalc as the main Excel program, and the other companies to develop their own Office software. So it's just interesting. Microsoft engulfed so many other products. So you had the Office line, and then you had the other products that came out. I just wonder if there would be a lot more. I want to say the competition was there, but Microsoft was like the EA of the business world and of operating systems. They were just engulfing everything, and so people were like, "Oh, I'm running MS-DOS. I'm also going to buy MS Word." And there was that whole thing about programs running better on MS-DOS that were Microsoft programs because they had some. They weren't documenting some functions of their operating system, so they had hidden routines that would make their software run better. I don't know if this is true or not, but it certainly sounds like something that they could do, given that they control the operating system as well. But yeah.
Just to draw a line in the sand, since this is about speculation and painting an alternate timeline, I just want to be sure that we've agreed on the same thing so far. Digital research would have created BASIC and most likely would have gotten the IBM deal, correct?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know if the IBM deal would have been a little bit different, but yeah, absolutely. They would have gotten the IBM deal. CPM would be loaded on pretty much everything.
What about you, Gene?
Well, so I think that's interesting, right? So that's the Microsoft not only delivered BASIC for the IBM PC, they delivered DOS, right? So they delivered the API that people wrote applications against. And I remember back at that time, if you bought an application for the IBM PC, the original IBM PC, and the AT and stuff like that, the XT. There were two kinds of applications at that time, pre-Windows, right? You had applications that would poke at the hardware and figure out what to do and work directly with the hardware, which were considered to be bad citizens because they couldn't easily be upgraded to a next version of DOS or something, right? And then applications which use the DOS API, they would actually talk to the DOS methods or the DOS interrupts. There's an interrupt you called, and then you basically programmed against the DOS API to get stuff done, like writing to files and stuff like that. And then some things use directly the PC BIOS, right? So anyway, so IBM created this substrate upon which a whole industry got built, and it was good enough, right? It was you had all these vendors building software against this interface. Well, what if DRI hadn't done as good a job of that? What if they had made a stinker of an OS that people couldn't easily target, or maybe DRI would charge them ridiculous royalties or something, or expensive developer licenses to get their stuff on there? And that's a way they could have thrown it. That's a way they could have screwed it up, and IBM's PC wouldn't have been so dominant. And then maybe Apple would have taken over. The Apple II was a viable business machine at that time. It was just because the IBM was a overall better deal that it took over.
That's something I did not consider. That's really
absolutely, Gene. Absolutely, I think you're right. Because Microsoft was at that time, they were the only company that offered an operating system, a programming language, and application software for the IBM. I mean, they offered all of that. So that was pretty much the complete package. So if CPM had only done a portion of it, or done a really bad job at it, I mean, would another company have come up like Apple? They were already well established at that time. Would that have taken over, and then we would just all be running Apples today? I don't know.
That sounds more likely to me, Gene, now that you mention it. Because, I mean, yes, Microsoft may not have been there, but while I certainly didn't know Gary Kildall, I've watched him a lot on the Computer Chronicles, and when combined with the history that we know about him, it doesn't seem like he would have been any more willing to go along with IBM's NDA. So either, I think it just probably wouldn't have happened. It would have happened, and like you said, they would have thrown it.
I don't know how much. So the IBM was this very open system, right? In some ways, too open. Like I said, that people were programming sometimes directly against the hardware instead of using the correct abstraction level. And the original IBM PC, it came with, at the time, the Apple II as well, they came with schematics. It came with schematics and everything you needed to know about the machine. And so, which of course, this is totally different from the Macintosh era, where there's a very clear divide between you're a user or a developer. You're not everybody's just like assumed to be given everything about like where resistors and capacitors are on the machine, right? And so what I'm getting at is I don't know how much of that decision about openness or lack of a decision, like some of it was like IBM didn't even really think about what the long term future of the IBM PC is when they put it out. In fact, they were surprised, right, about like how many were sold. It was and you saw that in the later on. IBM put out this, the PS2 line with the microchannel architecture, which no one supported because it cost so much to license it that IBM basically made it impossible to work with them. So I don't know how much of that decision was IBM keeping things open, maybe through benign neglect, right? And how much of that openness was Bill Gates and company seeing we've got to get the ecosystem built to get people using this, right? And I would say that maybe that is a lot of Bill Gates, right? Making sure those developers were brought on board.
That's a very good point. So I think what we can definitively say is without the combination of IBM and Microsoft, the standard may not have been as strong as it is now. So, for the sake of time, we do need to move forward a little bit. So then at this point, we have players like Apple, Commodore, Atari. So if that standard never came to be and never became agreed upon within the development community, the user community, the hardware community, do you think that hardware and software would be much more siloed than it is today?
I think it's very possible. I mean, at that time, so I was, like a guy tinkering with all these systems. You really couldn't write a piece of software that would work on all these systems without significant effort. There were video games and stuff. You mentioned EA, which is funny because they're like the company I remember as a kid. Was like the hero of making software for these platforms. But what they called a port was basically rewriting the whole application again for this other platform. Not what we could consider a port these days, where you just have to plug in a different abstraction layer or something. And so, and those vendors, they really didn't want, the Atari didn't want you to run Apple software. So they made it hard. So that it was actually, antagonistic to what you as a developer or user would want, is, not tying your investment in hardware to your investment in the rest of the ecosystem. All those vendors at the time really didn't get that. They were not really thinking about the long term in terms of portability and stuff like that.
I think that this would be a good time to go into the GUI operating systems. So as we all know, Windows came out. So Windows 1.0 came out in November of '85. And it didn't do that well, actually, in the beginning. But it was competing against the Macintosh. So let's take Microsoft out of the equation. You would have the Mac, but you would also have DR's GEM operating system. And Atari, with their modified version of GEM called TOS, which some people joke and say that's a Trammell operating system. It doesn't mean that, but Jack Trammell. Anyway, so I'm wondering, between all of those, if they would all have closed systems and there was no openness, which one would go on top? I mean, what would we be running today instead of Windows?
I think it would have been.
We might.
Oh, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I think it would have been anything that Jack Trammell touched, because the only one that was as driven and ruthless as Bill Gates, if not more so, was him.
Well, business is war, right?
That's his words.
That was his slogan. So if we go that route, then Atari computers would still be around today, and we would have TOS version 786 or whatever. But that's really interesting because Atari computers, they did okay, and then they did really bad somewhere in the 90s, and then that was it for Atari. If we would all be running Atari software, well, that would have also affected the console market.
Well,
I know that Atari... go ahead. Sure.
Sorry, I got nothing.
No, it's interesting because so Atari were the only ones that were able to kind of mimic the GUI that Apple had established for the Mac. GEM with their version GEM OS 1.0 looked a lot like the Mac OS, but they had some agreement with I think it was Atari that their look and feel couldn't be the same. So because of that, they had to change it in GEM 2.0. They had to change the look and feel of the GUI, while the Atari TOS stayed the same. So I'm wondering at this point, would the Atari ST line of computers have been the direct competitor to the Macintosh, and would it have been then the Macintosh, the IBM, and the Atari? And we're also forgetting, and we can't forget because that computer is just amazing, the Amiga with their Workbench software.
That's true. On the other hand, the thing about Jack Tramiel was he, in the case of Atari versus Commodore, he wasn't looking at the bigger picture. He got into feuds. He got into blood rivalries. And
Yeah.
his goal was at first crush TI and then crush Commodore. So maybe he may have done well on a smaller scale, just like he did before, but due to that narrow-sightedness, maybe he still would have went under, and Apple would be the dominant player, because it seemed like even back then they were looking at the larger picture, looking for true dominance rather than just trying to kill one other company.
Yeah, I mean, Apple went straight. They were competing against IBM. I never heard of Apple trying to compete against Atari or Commodore. They were trying to compete against IBM. Except Apple wasn't doing that great in somewhere in the mid '90s. So, but if you didn't have Microsoft as competition, they may have done a lot better.
Yeah. What are your thoughts so far, Gene?
Well, I've been thinking about that. It's interesting to think about. I hadn't really thought about. So before you said all that, I would have pegged Apple as the winner if there had been the winner of the standardizing the ecosystem, at least for business software, which then ended up being the big influencer on home use, right? So we had this kind of world where home computers were really where a lot of innovation was happening. And then IBM came in and standardized, business systems, and then that led to standardization back into the home systems, right? But you had all these different systems in the home. So the Atari 400, 800, I had a little experience messing with those. I never owned one, but I tinkered with them in schools and computer stores and stuff like that. And my friends had them, and Amigas, of course. But neither one strikes me as having had the ability to manage an ecosystem like the Atari 800. I remember was considered pretty powerful, but not considered at all usable for like seriously usable for business, like the Macintosh and the PC was. And so while it's possible to imagine an Atari that figured that out at the time, I seem to remember the Atari being really most focused on home stuff, and where it was doing business work, it was very light business work. Whereas the IBM and the Macintosh both had these bigger aspirations. And then Amiga, yeah, man, I love the Amiga too, but they never got their act together. And it's easy though to imagine. You mentioned Apple having its trouble in the mid '90s, and of course a lot of that was just due to them being rudderless. They fired Steve Jobs, and maybe that was a good thing at the time. I'm not sure that an Apple run by Steve Jobs continuously would. I'm pretty sure it would not be the Apple it is today, right?
Well, we wouldn't have had a Next computer and the Next powered OS X. So, yeah, that's a whole nother thing that we could talk about. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely that's too bad about the Amiga 2. I keep going back to it because I was blown away. But that's too bad. But I agree. I don't think so. Amiga never really got their act together. Commodore pretty much screwed them, and because of that, I don't really think Amiga would have been. They wouldn't have been it. It would have been between Apple and IBM. I wonder if IBM would have come up with their own GUI like OS2, except OS2 was originally developed by Microsoft, and then Microsoft dropped the ball, and so IBM went on its own and continued building OS2. So let's just say Microsoft didn't do that. They weren't even involved in OS2. Would they have come up with their own GUI to compete against Apple and Atari and Commodore in the home market?
I think they would have.
Yeah, I think they would have too. I think they would have.
So it's funny that you mentioned the alternate route that Apple would have taken. Um, it's fun to wonder if that rivalry was not there between Jobs and Gates, if Jobs would have stayed there, and if they had stayed there. And this is just looking a little bit further ahead. And I'll come right back to the IBM. If he had stayed there, like you said, Next wouldn't have happened. If Next wouldn't have happened, OS X would have happened. The underpinnings of iOS would not have happened, at least in its current form. And for all we know, without that history in place, mobile devices may not be recognizable compared to what they are today, or the mobile revolution may not have even happened.
Well, I mean, I think our operating systems would look a lot more like Palm and maybe BlackBerry. Microsoft had their own mobile operating system, and I'm just talking about strictly mobile. Microsoft had their mobile OS, their what was it, Windows CE? I forget.
It was Windows CE.
Okay, so yeah, our phones would probably be dominated by BlackBerry. I mean, they had nothing to do with Microsoft, and they had strong government contracts and whatnot. But absolutely, we wouldn't have these iOS devices. I actually don't even know if we would be at least in 2017 if we would still have if we would have the touch phones with an iPad and whatnot. We may still have the keyboards. I don't think BlackBerry. Well, I can't really say for sure, but I don't really think they were going that direction. So, yeah, that's another interesting thing. I can go back to IBM and Commodore and whatnot and say that HP might have come out and done something like purchase Commodore, because Commodore wasn't doing very well in the early 90s. And if Microsoft wasn't around, and HP thought that they could get into the home market, because there was no real strong contender except Apple, maybe, perhaps IBM's OS2, although that could change things up. But HP might have bought something like Commodore instead of developing their own PC clones with Microsoft software. So
that's very possible.
It's possible.
Okay, so how about we start considering, let's start looking a bit ahead, because it's fun to sit around here in the 80s and 90s, figure out what would have happened, who would have came out on top. But let's look at stuff that we can, with some level of confidence, say would either not be here or would just be here in a completely different form. Unix definitely would have been there.
I was about to say that Unix and enterprise software for sure, absolutely. For home computers, perhaps, yeah.
Microsoft, at first, was the biggest developer of Unix, starting with Xenix, but IBM killed that. But other forms of Unix came along. Berkeley still would have done its thing.
Gene, did you ever use Xenix?
I got to tinker with Xenix a little bit. So the Radio Shack store that was in the town where I live, which I was lucky that was there, that they had like a full Radio Shack store that had every possible thing there. And they had like an open door policy. I come in there as a kid and tinker with anything unless they were demoing something. So I got to tinker with Xenix. If I remember right, it was on the Model 2 and the Model 16 ran Xenix. And but I remember it took like 30 minutes to boot. Like it booted off these 8-inch floppy drives, and there was and like the machine they had there like had a hard drive, but it wasn't installed, and so it was ridiculous. It took literally like 25 or 30 minutes to boot before we could do anything with it. And so of course, being a kid having a short attention span, I would wander over to something else where you turn it on, you can immediately start hacking on it, right? So while I did get my fingers on Xenix, I had no idea what I was messing with at the time. I had never heard of Unix. It really, and everybody was living, well, at least everybody in my situation was living in a bubble then, right? Like the only way you learn about the rest of the world was going to the pharmacy and buying a magazine about whatever's going on in computers that month. And so there was no internet, there was no other way to know about anything. And so Xenix was like this alien software to me.
Sure.
Speaking of the internet, because we still would have had Unix, we still would have the internet.
Yes, absolutely. I think that a very big win for Microsoft uh, was including Internet Explorer in Windows 95. So that definitely drove a lot of people to use the internet.
Well, let's
So I
before you go further, sorry
Go
to cut
ahead.
you off. Let's make a differentiation. The internet and the web; those are not the same things.
Okay.
So,
Um,
Microsoft popularized the web with Internet Explorer.
sure. I mean, you had other service providers, like what is it, Prodigy and Genie. So I guess yeah, I guess you're right. I mean, they did popularize the web, the websites, web pages, and whatnot.
Well, you could
Um,
totally take that to okay. So at the time, the first thing I used was CompuServe, which was this terribly expensive, precursor to Prodigy and Genie and things like that. I remember, I used BBSs and CompuServe were my introduction to any kind of networking at all, which is over dial-up and very slow and all text based. But you had AOL at the time, so if you really want to imagine a terrible future, a terrible alternate history, is imagine that Windows 95 doesn't take off, that Bill Gates doesn't realize, hey, the web is the way to do things, and they back AOL, and everybody's using AOL instead of the web.
that's possible. Yeah, yeah. Having proprietary software, running these what were they, like, links? Um, their own. It was almost like a AOL. I don't want to call it intranet, but they had their own keywords and whatnot with their software. So it is possible that may have happened. Another thing that I think could have happened was Unix and something like Mozilla. Um, they could have popularized the web instead of having Internet Explorer, or even Netscape. Netscape had their browser too. They could have popularized the web, but you're right. Yeah, that's AOL. They were a strong player back then. So if there was no Internet Explorer, and they might have been still, they might still be around, or at least as we think of back then. I think there's yeah.
There might not have been a web if the alternate timeline that we talked about, where Next didn't happen. Tim Berners-Lee invented the web on a Next machine. That was the first web server. That's where the first web browser was created and ran. So, I mean, maybe he would have invented it elsewhere and on something else, but the hardware and software
You never
that he
know.
was using may not have been around.
I mean, your modern web could be more a descendant of Gopher, for example.
That's definitely going to be a topic of another episode.
Yeah,
I mean, when I first
absolutely.
encountered the web, it was through Gopher. I went through a Gopher browser to find the web.
And when you say the web, you mean something similar to the web, like text and hyperlinks. It ran on the internet, but it wasn't HTTP.
Well, through a Gopher browser, I found a page that described the web and said this is a better option. It was Tim Berners-Lee's site, right? And it said this is
Ah,
a better option than Gopher, and here's a browser, and here's what you need to do to get started with that.
I see.
Very, very interesting. Yeah, yeah. We absolutely. Yeah, this is see that the more we go off into the future, that the more hazy it becomes. So um yeah, I don't know what the web would look like today. You know what? It's possible that Tim Berners-Lee would have developed the quote unquote web in a different machine later on. And so our web today wouldn't look like it does today. We would probably be a few years back.
Yeah, I mean, Tim Berners-Lee's invention. The cool thing he did isn't the browser or the server. The cool thing he did is HTTP and the URL, because before that you had no way to uniquely describe something somewhere, right? So you'd tell somebody, hey, there's a file you want the Linux kernel, you want to go download this crazy Linux thing, which I was doing at the time before the web, right? I mean, you had to like go log into this FTP server in Sweden, and from this university and download it. But if you wanted to tell someone where that is, you couldn't give them just one canonical string to do that. You had to say, oh, go to this FTP site, log in anonymously, go to this directory and download that. And then there was Gopher. Well, there was like no easy way to say, you'd say, well, go to this Gopher site, follow these different links, and you'll go get the document I'm talking about. And so Tim Berners-Lee wanted to unify how you describe the documents, right? Give every document a noun, so that you could pass these around to each other. And so he could have built that atop Gopher or something else.
He could have,
Sure.
And he probably would have done it on some other variant of Unix.
Yeah, he could have built the whole thing on top of FTP.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
And then
I think of this.
And then we would all need an extra port running for our web servers.
In this alternate universe, I foresee Unix being the king in enterprise software, unless IBM pulled a rabbit out of its hat with OS2. OS2 or TOS or Mac OS would have been the operating system of choice for personal computers. For home computers, I think that might have gone to Mac OS. And what about gaming? So MS DOS, I mean, I don't want to say that they were the only ones doing PC gaming back then, absolutely not, but they definitely helped. They helped the PC get mainstream support. You know, Windows 95 made it popular. DirectX, the API that DirectX brought us, unifying architecture to where we could have different video cards, and then OpenGL, of course, they were around too. But let's just say DirectX was a huge proponent of getting us games nowadays. So what would gaming look like today if Microsoft wasn't around? I mean, I don't remember Mac OS games being amazing back then. Even Windows 3.1 games were pretty terrible. But DOS games were pretty good. So would we be running games on CP/M?
Well, maybe the Amiga might still be around as the dominant game platform, because that was right around when the Amiga started to fail. When Windows started to eat their lunch, when DOS and Windows started to eat their lunch when it came to games, that was right when things were really going downhill. So maybe we might still have some awesome PC gaming going on the Amiga platforms, maybe on the Ataris too. We definitely would not have an Xbox. That much we know for sure.
Oh yeah.
But that's consoles. That's later. So yeah, I think, my opinion, I think the Amiga might still be around in some form and come out on top as a gaming system, assuming they manage to get their management together, which they might not have either. The only other viable alternative for app gaming, as you said, on PCs was Apple. And yeah, that's never been good.
Yeah. I definitely agree that Amiga could have been the dominant gaming platform for, I guess, quote unquote PC gaming, not console gaming. I absolutely agree. After seeing what the Amiga could do, I could see it as being the platform. CP/M games, though, might have been something similar to DOS. So we also need to think about that. I mean, there were a lot of Amiga games that also ran on DOS. And then Atari, of course, had some games on their systems that were ported over to the Amiga and vice versa. So it's interesting, but I definitely saw the Amiga as having the better hardware. Would CP/M have been friendly enough to developers to be able to make really, really good PC games that would compete with the Amiga and possibly win? I don't know. But I definitely see the Amiga as being a strong contender. They just had really, really terrible management. So
were you much?
It's hard to theorize.
Were you much into early PC gaming, Gene?
No, not at all. In fact, it's funny listening to you guys talk about that. I'm trying to think about what that would look like, because I played some games early on, on the Commodore 64. I never played any PC games really. A little bit here and there. I played SimCity, for example. And then a couple years ago I played Portal. That was fun, but I didn't finish it. I barely finished the game. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because you mentioned how terrible Windows 3.1 and early Windows 95 was and Apple was for gaming. And that's mostly because the game developers needed to work directly with the hardware to get the performance they wanted. And you couldn't do that with Windows 3.1 or Windows 95, and certainly not on the Macintosh, right? You couldn't talk directly to the hardware that way. But on the PC with DOS, you could just drop down to the hardware and do it, right? And it was terrible, because if you were loading a game on the PC, you had to tell it all these things when you installed it, like, I have a Sound Blaster and it's on interrupt 3 versus interrupt 5, and I've got this kind of joystick and it's on interrupt 7 versus interrupt 11, and I got this kind of graphics card, because none of that was standard, right? So and you couldn't safely probe those things, and so it held back the market, because people really, only geeks bought games. You couldn't just buy a game like you can now and someone play it. But something you said, Chris, made me wonder. You didn't mention Nintendo, right? So I'm wondering, like, whoever had the best hardware had a big advantage, but also whoever cultivated the ecosystem had an advantage. Is it possible that one of those console games could have evolved into the best gaming platform?
Maybe. I still think that there would still be a definite separation between console gamers and PC gamers. You may be familiar with the term PC Master Race and dirty console peasants.
No, I was not until now.
So that I think that separation may still be around, but I do think, however, that the console market would be very different. Maybe, for example, the Dreamcast may still have a shot at being alive. Sega might still be in the hardware industry.
The Amiga 32 would be king.
Yeah, they did have a dedicated game console.
No, but it didn't do well against Nintendo and
No.
Actually, Microsoft wasn't even around. I mean, they weren't doing consoles back then anyway when the Amiga 32 failed. So
Nintendo would still be dominant back then with gaming, certainly.
It'd be mostly between Nintendo and Sony, I think, today, and it'd kind of be like Intel and AMD. Choose, and you don't have any other choice.
Yeah, and right now, I mean, the market has been bearing 3 consoles for decades, so it could be Nintendo, Sony, and Sega still.
Maybe, yeah, that's true. I wanted to talk about another part, which was, and actually this has to do with that unifying architecture, Gene, that you were talking about. And it's, how people build computers nowadays? We buy the processor and motherboard and graphic cards and everything. We put it all together. Without MS-DOS and then Windows, would we be doing that today? Or would that be all just proprietary parts for individual computers like the Commodore and the Amiga? And so,
I don't know. There's an interesting path dependence there, because really it was, IBM's, like I described before, is benign neglect about, creating this standard without even really planning for it that allowed that to be possible. But what if someone didn't do that, right? What if they, if whoever won, said, no, you may not, deal with these low-level details. You've got to program to our API so we can improve things, innovate beneath you, right? And so that was both a good thing and a bad thing. You had stuff, Windows would have loved to be able to ditch DOS earlier, right? So that not every application had to know about which printer you had, and so they could, put that into a printing API, right? But yeah, what if you had this API that software programmed against and wasn't allowed to know about anything below that hardware abstraction layer? Yeah, you might see a lot of other crazy things, right, out there. too far. People would for years people said, they still say it. It's been wrong for a long time. They'll talk about, is this for the Mac or the PC? Well, what's the PC? You don't mean the PC. You don't mean the IBM PC. You mean the API and hardware stack that is, Intel and Windows.
Right.
So there's been no IBM PC for a long time. You can get that implementation of that stack from Intel and Windows from all these components, just like you said. But if they hadn't allowed that, if they had said no, you're going to program directly to our API, and we can change things underneath you, there may be a big rich mix of weird vendors out there.
I think that hardware would be a lot more expensive. Let's say a video card. You would have to buy a video card that's specific to a machine. And so if that company, let's say NVIDIA, wanted to create video cards for lots of different machines, then they would have to, that would make it a lot more expensive for them to develop.
Yeah.
If they were making for specific machines. So I really think that hardware would just be way more expensive and would be tailored to individual.
Well, I think you're
machines.
definitely right. I mean, when I was doing kind of big Unix development in the mid '90s, that was where we was on very expensive hardware. From Silicon Graphics and Sun and HP and IBM. All that's gone now. It's all Intel running Windows or Linux, and the world's better for it.
Yeah,
I would be inclined to agree there. As many years as I've spent hating on Microsoft, without that standard, you're right. The world the computing world would be nowhere near as good as it is now. But maybe another standard would have emerged. I mean, it would have to, if it was going to survive outside of the specialized, very expensive hardware market. And if it didn't, then the proliferation of microcomputers in every home may not have happened. It may have been relegated to businesses. The internet would still be there, but the web, even if it was technically feasible, may not have become anywhere near as popular. And we may not have mobile devices, and we would be socializing with each other and playing more board games.
No, that's a really good point, Chris. I think you make is that okay. So the question is, what if Microsoft never existed? But for the longest time, Microsoft's statement, like their vision statement, their mission statement, was something like a computer on every desk and in every home. And so, so that was their mission, right? Was to democratize computing in that way, right? And they achieved that. Like they got to the point where their sales were down because everybody already had a computer on every desk in every home, right? And there was no growth left, and so they had to do different things. So what if the winner that you guys described had a different mission, a different their mission hadn't been that. I think you just made that point that if Microsoft hadn't won, that it'd be a totally different world.
It would be, and that leads me to the last part, actually. Unless you guys have more to say about this, but if not, I have one
last thing.
I was wondering. Go ahead before I say this final thing.
Some of the best mice and keyboards to ever have been made would never exist.
That's true. My first optical mouse was a Microsoft mouse. Yeah. All right. So, so who would be labeled the evil company? You know how everybody associates Microsoft as being evil, which now with this enlightening podcast, I see that if they were evil, they were definitely a necessary evil, because I think the world is better. Because they did what they were around and did their thing. But who would be the evil company? Would it be Jack Tramiel's evil Atari computers, or with their "business is war" slogan? Just wondering there.
I don't think I would have it in me to hate Gary Kildall. I don't know. Something about him is just a truly likable guy. I don't see DRI being the at least hated company. Evil and hated, they don't necessarily go hand in hand, but I don't want to believe that it would be digital research. However, if they did become the standard with IBM, maybe.
I mean, so a lot of business practices that Microsoft did landed them in court many times, and that's why programmers even started saying that it was hard to deal with them, or or they would quote they would call them the evil company, because they would drive other businesses out of business. So it's kind of like plopping a Walmart and it taking over mom and pop shops. So that's why. Would Gary Kildall and DRI have done that? I don't know, but I want to say that probably not. He didn't seem like that type of person.
Or
Um,
maybe
mhm.
Gary getting a taste for victory would have went pure Dynasty evil, and we would be giving him the nickname Gary Kill All.
I somehow think that Jack Tramiel would have won on top there. He would have done something to
I,
screw DRI over.
I just want to put in a vote for Apple. Apple could have been a very evil company, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I agree. I actually I don't hate them today, but I definitely don't like some of their business practice. So I can definitely see them being the quote unquote evil company today. Absolutely.
Yeah, if Microsoft and IBM hadn't kept them honest in like
Mm-hmm.
through the late '80s, early '90s, and they hadn't had the near death of experience in the mid '90s, I think they would have had a lot more power to tell people what to do and what they could do and what they couldn't do. I mean, so like the early Macintosh era. It was you build apps their way. You had to go
Right.
buy a Lisa, which cost like $10,000 to even like
Mm-hmm.
develop software for the early Macintosh. It was totally not like the IBM world where anybody on an IBM could develop software for an IBM, right? And so what if Apple had a monopoly and leverage that? It's totally possible to consider them as being the evil winner there.
I agree. I can definitely see Apple being the next evil company. Absolutely. There's things now that they do that I don't like. I wasn't able to load a West Sierra on my 2009 Mac Pro. Why? Because, well, the 2010 is the one supported, not 2009. Come on. So yeah, that's I can see them doing that. Anything else that you all want to add to this? I have a small list of things that allowed Microsoft to solidify their position, but I wanted to kind of give you all the opportunity to say.
Well, I just want to put in a vote. I already nominated Apple as the evil company, but I want to paint a more bleak scenario for you.
Mm-hmm.
The web doesn't exist, but at the time the web is taking off, people are trying to dial up and trying to plug things into each other, and they're trying to get connected, and they're trying to unify around how to communicate. And at that time, I knew people like businessmen who were like on the like had connections to these systems. They'd have like a Prodigy address, an AOL address, a CompuServe address, just so they could receive an email on any of those systems because they may be getting an email from somebody. What if AOL had won? What if AOL had won? Like everything, like anything you wanted to do, you'd have to go get permission from AOL. Like if I want to build a website and what we would think of as a website, an application, I'd have to go get permission from them to do it. That's not a world that you want to live in.
No, no.
It seems like a world that we're running headlong back into.
Yeah, there's definitely a tension there, and we got to keep that from happening if we possibly can.
All of our messaging systems have become siloed again. Most people spend all of their time on Facebook, do all of their messaging on Facebook. There are pages on Facebook, which is very much like pages that were on AOL.
Yeah, yeah. Google Plus has their own. Google has its own ecosystem too. So yeah.
But yeah,
I can see how we're. It's all coming back.
I agree. AOL winning would be a dark, bleak, and scary future, and without Microsoft, I think would have been very, very possible.
And Microsoft could have made that decision, right? They could have said, "Hey, we're going to back AOL instead of backing the web."
They could have. or any other company that would have replaced Microsoft. I don't know, IBM's OS2, OS3, OS4, whatever it might be now, or
Yeah.
they might have backed up AOL or CPM, Gem Windows, or whatever you want to call that. They could have.
There is one thing that we did not cover. Where would Linux be?
Well, I definitely see Linux still being the home. Unix, of course, being the enterprise software. Well, I mean, Linux has enterprise software, so I think that Linux would absolutely be king in the enterprise software world, unless IBM, of course, made some version of their OS2, like OS2 NT or something like that, which is possible. But I think that without Windows, Unix would definitely have a stronger presence on the enterprise world. As far as the home market, that just depends on. I guess that depends on how good the home software was.
Well, let's consider that Linux got started. Oh, geez, what was it, Gene? 1991 when Linux started?
Yeah, 91. I think I had it in 92.
That's right.
But I think it was 91 is when it got started.
And he wrote it as an alternative to MS DOS on his IBM 386. Now, if we didn't have the IBM standard, I mean, yes, Linus would still be alive and be a gifted software engineer, but without all the circumstances falling into place, would he still have written Linux? Or, I'm sorry, Mr. Stallman, GNU/Linux.
I guess that depends on how bad CPM was at that time.
Yeah, what if there'd been maybe something else would exist that was multitasking on equivalent hardware, and he wouldn't have had the urge. And then the other possible outcome is maybe the Unix vendors got their act together, and there wasn't. Torvalds had to make Linux because there was no freely available Unix at the time, right? And that was just a total colossal failure of AT&T and the Unix vendors to, again, just like back in the Atari and Commodore days, that they didn't want portability. They said they would support it, but they really wanted to lock people into their version of Unix.
Right.
Yeah. It seems like everybody was wanting to lock people into their own versions of stuff.
So what we keep coming back to, and this feels ironic, despite the proprietary nature of Microsoft, and all of the allegedly dirty practices they've done over the years, without them, we would not have such an open, non-locked-in world that we do now.
Yes.
And
yes, absolutely.
Whether that was intentional or not, we come back to I'm happy it happened.
Me too. This podcast has definitely made me see Microsoft in a different way. I actually I feel that I owe them, in some way for me being into computers today and whatnot. It wouldn't be the same. So I have I now feel gratitude for them.
Same here. I feel like I just dropped about a decade's worth of hatred. This was therapeutic.
We should change this. We should change this podcast to what, like technology therapy or something. I do have a list of things that helped Microsoft solidify their position. So any other company would have had to that wanted to be the next Microsoft, let's say Apple or whichever. It would have been good for them to follow this particular path or this particular set. And it's 10 things that I wrote down. So let's say DRI, if they would have done all of these things, they would be the next Microsoft. Number one would be the deal with IBM to license to go through. So not not to look away from the non-disclosure agreement. That was one thing. So, like I said, when the IBM PC debuted, Microsoft is the only company that offered an operating system, programming language, software for the new computer. That company, whichever one it may be, would have been to everyone's benefit, including that company's, to have all of that. Aggressiveness towards the market, eager to sell. So that's something else that Microsoft was very aggressive in marketing their software, and just they were kind of like a little, or I guess a big Jack Tramiel back then. So that's something else. I have here the Microsoft Mouse and Microsoft Press educated and enabled users to use computers. So that would have been something else that would have been good. So that would bring the computers out of the hobbyists and included more people that wanted to know about computers but didn't have the resources to, or maybe they were just afraid of computers. So that brought in a lot of new people to the computing world. Let's see. I have quick release of business line products like Word and Office. So that brought in the business market, and so a lot of revenue came from that. Vision in GUI operating systems like Windows. So we had already discussed this, that Atari had their TOS operating system and DRI had their GEM. So we were certainly going that direction, and Mac had their OS. So we were definitely going in that GUI direction. But Microsoft also had that Vision. Vision in enterprise software. So Windows NT being the Microsoft variant. So in this, would it be Unix? Would DRI have some sort of enterprise software version of CPM? I have Vision in the web, and I had used Internet Explorer as the browser that people went to because it was included with their operating system. It made it so much easier. It invited people to the web, it already came built in. You didn't have to buy anything. So that would be something else that would bring that company closer to being the Microsoft now. And then I also put Vision in home entertainment because I wanted to bring the Xbox in there, and that's done really well too. So the final and most important thing that I put is appealing to the mass market by investing in marketing and just novice computer users. So Microsoft pretty much put a welcome mat on the PC world, on the computing world, to anybody that wanted to use computers, and that's just it's amazing. And a lot of people hate Microsoft now, but man, they definitely rolled out that welcome mat for everybody. So that's the 10 things that I wrote down. It's the formula to any company that, if they could go back in time and do those 10 things, they would be the next Microsoft now.
That's a very good and well-researched list.
Thanks. That's it. I don't have anything else to add to this, but
same here.
Yeah.
How about you, Gene?
No, that was very exhaustive. No, I agree with all that. Yeah, it's easy to imagine someone else coming and doing some of those things there, but yeah, they've really had a pretty profound influence on our whole system here.
Okay, so I think we can call this one a wrap then.
I want to give a special thanks to Eugene for joining our podcast, being our guest star. Your input has been very valuable, and thank you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I was going to agree with everything Euro said.
Well, it's been my sincere pleasure to talk with you guys tonight. It's been a lot of fun, and you guys have made me think about some things differently. So that's been very, very useful. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and thank you again for your time. So that is a wrap of episode 4. Until next time.
Till next time. Hello, Chris?
I also lost Chris.
Oh boy. Oh no. Let me maybe he lost internet connection or something. Type in the chat. This is gonna definitely go in the bloopers. Man, I was about to go into OS 2.
Are we?
Oh, there you go.
Hey, Chris.
Yeah,
welcome back.
My network connection dropped out.
Oh no.
Blooper time.
So we're pushing an hour, and we're barely in the 90s.
There's just a lot. There's just so much this goes in a bunch of different directions.